Welcome back to another episode of the Outdoor Adventures podcast here on Brownfield. I'm Brent Barnett. And on our show this week, we're talking about mushroom hunting. As I know a lot of folks have really been out here, throughout the month of April, early May, finding morels, but there's also a lot of different types of mushrooms in the woods. And here today to help us out on some tips and tell us all about it is Chelsea Harbach with Iowa State University. Chelsea, thanks for coming on the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Brent. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. As we get started, you might tell the listeners more about your background with Iowa State and just some of the work that you do.
Absolutely. I'm a plant pathologist. I tell people, when I do the mushroom workshops here on campus, that my journey to loving fungi is a little unconventional compared to most people who love fungi. My journey was through the world of plant pathology. Because like plant pathogenic fungi were like really like my first like love when I found plant pathology. And my love for fungi just like grew from there. I'm originally from Northwest Illinois. I did my undergrad and master's at University of Illinois, and then I came to Iowa State for my PhD. I've always known I wanted to be a plant disease diagnostician, but there weren't any opportunities for me after I finished my doctorate. So I was with Illinois Extension for a few years, and then had an opening to come back to Iowa State for my dream job, which also included coordinating and teaching the wild harvested mushroom certification workshops. So I get to like have like, you know, mushrooms like be a part of like my actual job, which is like super exciting and fulfilling for me.
That's really cool. Growing up as a kid, I remember my dad taking me mushroom hunting. And remember the first time I actually finally saw a morel on the ground. And at that point, I think I had stepped on 10 of them and
Uh-huh.
not seen him at that point. You kind of have to get the eye for them. How about
Absolutely.
you? Did you grow up mushroom hunting yourself?
I didn't. I remember like people talking about going morel hunting, and I honestly like did not know what they were talking about. Like they might as well have been saying like what was it like the oh what was that fake thing that they would like skink or not skink because that's a real thing, but like oh I almost had it. But like they talk about like this like fake thing about like making people go hunting for it, and so I thought like morels was like kind of a similar thing. It wasn't until like sometime in high school someone brought a bunch of morels that they had found for us, and I was like, oh, that's a morel. But even then, like my interest in fungi hadn't like developed yet. So like I yeah, now I know more than probably most people on like the technicalities of fungi, but I'm still very much a novice when it comes to mushroom hunting.
Let's focus on morels first. What's kind of the main timing as we look across the Midwest? I know obviously a lot of people really try to hit it in April, and we're probably getting a little late now because we're close to
Yeah.
mid-May. But
Mhm.
still seeing some posts online, Chelsea, of people in some northern states like say
Yep.
Minnesota, Wisconsin, that they're still finding some yellow morels.
They are, yeah. So obviously like spring is the best time. And as you mentioned, we're kind of nearing the tail end of the ideal timing for finding morels in Iowa, but there's definitely still people finding some in northern Iowa. Um, Generally like mid-April to like mid-May is our window for morels. And that'll kind of depend on the spring we have, if we have like cold snaps that might like set the soil temperature back a little bit. Because it's like very largely dependent on soil temperature. So that can be like one of the best indicators or like things to watch as far as like when it's time to go out and start looking.
I was really interested to see how things would shape up this year because if you remember, we had kind of a really warm March, warmer than
Hmm.
expected, and people were like planting their crops early. Were
Hmm.
you hearing of things heating up early this year?
I mean, I knew it was something that I was worried about from like the perspective of just like plant health. Like plants like perennials like budding out and like I've actually there one of our horticulture faculty wrote an article about like, why there weren't any magnolia blossoms this year, and that had to do with, the temperature. But it's Iowa. I in the Midwest, I felt pretty good about like that, like it wasn't here to stay. And sure enough, we cooled right back down in April. And and kind of set things back on the right track, which is nice because yeah, when the weather's weird, all you can do is like watch the soil temperatures, and sure enough, we plateaued and stopped warming up, and it was okay.
Yep. I know a lot of our plants were confused with that early start. And if anybody's
Mhm.
been the town I live in, Pella, famous for the Tulip Time Festival. I think
Yep.
this was the earliest I'd ever seen the tulips bloom here in town. But
Mhm.
when we talk about morels, Chelsea, what are some of your main tips for folks on how to find them, environments, areas to look for, those types of things?
So they're gonna be like favorite areas that have like retain soil moisture a little bit better, around like dying elms, dying oak trees, even sometimes, just like dead decaying trees, or like trees that are in decline. Even it doesn't have to be a completely dead tree. It can just be a tree that has been in the process of dying, because that means there will be like dead roots in the ground. And and surprisingly, when I was out this past weekend looking in southeast Iowa, and we found some actually like growing in some like a grassy area with like tall grass. And that was different and like weird, not like unexpected. So I'm gonna say, like, we have these ideas of like the best places to look for morels, but I think that we shouldn't limit ourselves to like looking only in those areas, because you never know when you might find them in places that are like completely unexpected, that like you've never found them before.
I remember a spot specifically when I was a young kid, and like 2 or 3 straight years. It was just a really good spot. We found a whole bunch of them, and then it just
Mm-hmm.
like dried up and
Yep.
never found them ever again in that spot.
And that's how it goes. Like it's like you can have memories of these like awesome spots, and like you always go back to check for them, because like you remember them, but like they just like stop showing up, and I can't tell you why that happens.
Yep.
Like, I don't know, mushrooms are weird, fungi are weird, but
Oh,
cool.
yeah. Yeah, they're very cool. And like we had mentioned at the beginning, there's also different types. So while morel season may be winding down or has ended in some areas, might just talk with the listeners, Chelsea, what else is out there in the woods?
So people are already starting to find well, all different kinds of oyster mushrooms, but golden oyster mushrooms are really, they're very prolific and easy to find, partially because they're actually like they're not technically invasive. I like, got like checked this with like DNR and iDolls. But it's an escapee from a commercial grow kit. It's like the species is from China. So it's very prolific. It doesn't have, the same kind of like ecological niche as our native oyster mushrooms. So you can find a lot of golden oyster mushrooms. People are also already finding pheasant back or dryad saddle, which is a good choice edible. And I don't know, in like a couple months here, we might start finding chicken of the woods, hen of the woods. And actually this spring yet, if we're lucky, chanterelles should be popping up pretty soon. So those are good ones to look out for. It is also important to like make sure that you're picking mushrooms that are known to be edible, or like non-toxic at least. any any mushroom is edible once, right? Um, so yeah, like making sure that you're confident in your identification. There's a little bit of controversy about some of the like morel. lookalikes that we classically consider poisonous. And like in our publication, there's a safe mushroom foraging book that my predecessor worked on and is available through the extension store, that still lists these Verpa species and Gyrometra species as toxic. There are people who don't agree with that anymore. We're not going to comment on like whether or not people should eat mushrooms. We're just going to go with what like the data says, and they can get mad at us if they want to. That's okay. Like I said, any mushroom is edible once. Not that like these are like mushrooms that are gonna like kill you, but like they could over time. Um, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think it's worth the risk. Um, but yeah, there's plenty of other like good edible mushrooms that you can find out there that we know aren't toxic, and they're really easy to identify as well.
Are there any myths to say like morel hunting? Like two that I think of right off the bat, and I don't know necessarily if they're myths or not. I just don't know what's the truth, I guess. So you
Mhm.
always hear people say and post online, don't go to comment sections on Facebook, right?
Yeah, right.
But it's always, well, you should be carrying the morels you find in a mesh bag to let the
Spread
spores
the
spread out while
spores.
you walk. I don't know if that's true or not. And then the other one related to that is you see folks post about, well, you shouldn't pull the mushroom fully out of the ground. You should be cutting it close to the base and leaving the stem to grow back next year. I mean, are those myths? I have no idea, Chelsea, to be honest.
So, I don't know if there's any like science-backed information, but the concept of like when you're foraging mushrooms, putting them in a mesh bag to let the spores, spread, like that's not going to do any harm. I don't know, how much it's actually going to help, but it's not going to hurt. The biggest thing is to make sure that you're not collecting your mushrooms in plastic, because plastic promotes moisture collection, which promotes decay. So, paper bags are great, mesh bags are great, anything that's going to encourage, that air circulation, and avoid, moisture collection. So I don't know, maybe that's why they would say mesh bags or like baskets for spreading spores is just like another way to get people to avoid using plastic. I don't know. And then as far as like harvesting, um, you're not going to do any harm if you like pull the whole thing out of the soil, because the like fungus itself, has an elaborate and like huge network of mycelia in the ground that are still going to be there. I think best practices are to like use a knife and cut it above the soil level to avoid introducing any soil which could have different kinds of microbes that could cause upset stomachs, just to avoid introducing like that soil into like the fresh, open um, tissue. I mean, you're going to wash your mushrooms anyways, but anything you can do to
Sure.
like prevent like the introduction of more dirt and debris is really helpful, and like just kind of like good food safety practices.
One before we go here, one last mushroom I wanted to ask about: giant puffballs. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I'll just be honest. Before moving to Iowa back in 2015, had never heard of giant puffballs until I
Mm-hmm.
started watching some shows
Mm-hmm.
online. And at one point, I was doing some deer hunting about, it was probably 3 or 4 seasons ago, on some public land. I was on my walk in with my bow, and I went up into this thick ridge, and like I really had to duck down. It was really thick in cover. And I just remember looking up that ridge, and there were these giant, look like volleyballs coming out of the ground
Mm-hmm.
in this area. And there were probably 30 of them. I've never seen them
Mm-hmm.
before. Turns out it was the giant puffballs, right?
Yep.
So,
Yep.
and that was in the fall, and they were pretty,
Yep.
yellow on top and dented in and
Yeah.
stuff. But are
Yeah.
those edible for people? I have
They
no idea.
they are edible, but like any like fungus you're gonna find like foraging or just being outside, they have like kind of a ideal window for edibility. If you find them early enough, and you're like as you're like cutting them, they kind of have the texture. I don't know if you've ever eaten tofu. I eat tofu. People use it like and prepare it like tofu because the texture is very similar. It absorbs, flavors and like marinades and stuff. But yeah, they are edible. It's just you have to find them at the right time before they start like kind of like forming like channels and stuff where the spores are formed. So yeah, it just depends on the timing.
Yeah.
I
I
don't, I
was
don't think
just
it's going to make you sick if you eat it too late, but it just probably isn't going to taste as good.
Sure. I was just curious because that was the first
Mhm.
time I'd ever seen them. And like I said, there was at
They're
least 30
cool.
of them on this ridge
Yeah,
side.
they're really cool.
I've never been back to that spot since. It was a ways back in an area I'd only been to that one time. I wonder
Hmm.
if in the spring, if morels grow around puffballs
Oh,
or not. I'm not sure.
I'm
I
not
guess I'll have
sure
to go
either.
back.
Uh-huh.
Maybe I found
Cool.
somebody's honey hole. Who knows?
Maybe.
Oh, that's great. Well, hey, Chelsea, thanks so much for coming on the show here. If anybody is interested in your work or the department's work, how do they stay connected with Iowa State?
So we have there's a couple different things. We do have a page on the Natural Resources Extension webpage where you can find our like mushroom hunting calendar, where like list of mushroom species and like the calendar, like when you can find them or whatever. Um, if you're interested in, like a wild harvested mushroom certification, that's a workshop that I do in the springs for people who want to legally sell wild harvested mushrooms. There's a separate web page for that, but you just search wild harvested mushroom Iowa and you'll find the page. Um, Otherwise, most of my time is spent helping people with plant health problems. So if you have sick plants, or my colleague does insect identification, if you find weird bugs you want identified, you can stay in touch with us through, we have a Facebook page, or you can email us directly at pidc@iastate.edu.
Perfect. Well, hey, thank you so much. Have a great spring, and hopefully we can have you back on the show sometime.
Sounds great. Thank you, Brent.
Again, that's Chelsea Harbach with Iowa State University. And thanks a lot for joining us here on Outdoor Adventures this week. I'm Brent Barnett.